Some hearts don't stop beating when they're broken. They simply forget why they ever beat at all. I used to believe grief had an expiration date, something people whispered to comfort themselves when they didn't know what else to say. They promised the mornings would become lighter, the silence less cruel, the memories softer around the edges. They were wrong. 3 years had passed since the woman I was supposed to marry disappeared from my future, and every Tuesday night, I still found myself standing beneath the old oak tree overlooking Rose Hill Cemetery, with a bouquet of white roses slowly wilting in my hands. The marble beneath my fingertips always felt colder than the evening air, as though even stone understood what it meant to hold on forever. Rain drifted through the branches above me, gentle enough to sound like distant applause against the leaves, while the city shimmered beyond the hill in scattered gold lights. That city belonged to me, at least according to the newspapers, the politicians, and the businessmen who smiled too quickly whenever I entered a room. They believed power was measured in buildings, bank accounts, and the number of people willing to obey without asking questions. None of them knew the truth. A man who cannot sleep is never truly powerful. Every luxury in my penthouse overlooked Manhattan's skyline. Yet every night, I found myself staring at reflections instead of the view. The silence followed me everywhere. My security team waited 20 yards away, pretending not to notice the routine they had memorized years ago. No one interrupted me here. No one dared. They understood this was the only place where Adrian Blackwood stopped being the man the world feared and became someone painfully ordinary. Someone who still carried conversations that would never be answered. I set the roses against the stone and whispered words the wind always stole before they reached anyone. Then I turned away because staying longer only made leaving harder. My black SUV rolled quietly through streets still damp from the evening shower, passing coffee shops where couples laughed over half-finished drinks and families hurried home beneath shared umbrellas. Life continued with stubborn determination. Mine simply moved beside it. When my driver finally pulled beneath the glowing entrance of Blackwood Medical Tower, I almost told him to keep driving. The injury in my shoulder wasn't serious. A strained muscle from an accident days earlier. My physician insisted physical therapy would prevent permanent stiffness. I considered canceling. Healing had never interested me. But 10 minutes later, I stepped into the rehabilitation clinic, expecting another forgettable appointment. Instead, a woman looked up from a patient chart with calm green eyes, offered a small smile that carried no fear, no curiosity, and no recognition, then quietly said, "Good evening, Mr. Blackwood. I'm Claire Bennett, and today we're going to help your shoulder remember how to move again." For reasons I couldn't explain, it felt like she had spoken to something far more broken than my shoulder. The first session should have lasted 45 minutes. I walked out after 23, not because my shoulder hurt, although it did every time I reached above chest level, but because Claire Bennett refused to treat me the way everyone else did. She never stumbled over my name. She never stared too long. She never filled the silence with nervous compliments or carefully chosen words. She simply asked practical questions, studied the range of motion in my shoulder, and corrected every shortcut I tried to take with calm confidence. "You are compensating with your back," she said as she gently adjusted my posture. "If you keep doing that, your shoulder will heal the wrong way." I almost laughed. Hundreds of people had spent years compensating for my presence, changing their behavior the moment I entered a room. She was the first person who seemed completely uninterested in doing that. "Do you always tell your patients they are wrong?" I asked. She smiled without looking up from her notes. "Only the ones who are actually wrong." It was such an ordinary answer that it caught me off guard. Ordinary had disappeared from my life a long time ago. Outside the treatment room, my security detail remained exactly where they always did, watching every hallway, every elevator, every unfamiliar face. Patients whispered when they recognized them. Nurses pretended not to notice. Claire ignored them entirely. When the session ended, she handed me a printed sheet of exercises. "Twice a day," she said. "Do not skip them because you think you are too busy." I looked at the paper but did not take it immediately. "Do you know who I am?" Her green eyes finally met mine. "Yes. You are my 4 o'clock appointment with a strained rotator cuff." For a second, I forgot how to answer. Then she placed the paper in my hand, nodded politely, and called for her next patient before I had even reached the door. The drive back to my penthouse felt unusually quiet. My driver asked if I wanted to return the following week. I should have said no. I should have found another therapist, another clinic, another reason to avoid whatever had unsettled me in that room. Instead, I heard myself say, same day, same time. That evening, I unfolded the exercise sheet on the marble kitchen island beside an untouched glass of sparkling water. At the bottom, beneath the diagrams and instructions, Claire had written one sentence in neat blue ink. Healing is rarely comfortable, but staying broken always costs more. I read those words again as rain tapped softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows. For the first time in years, I found myself wondering if someone had looked past the reputation, the tailored suits, and the endless headlines long enough to notice the man still standing beneath all of it. The exercises became part of my mornings before I ever admitted they mattered. Every sunrise found Manhattan wrapped in pale gold beyond my windows while I stood in the quiet of my apartment, slowly repeating the movements Claire had shown me with the patience of someone who believed every small improvement deserved respect. My shoulder responded little by little, but something else shifted even more quietly. Tuesday afternoons no longer felt like obligations. They became appointments I never considered canceling. Claire noticed the difference before I did. Better, she said one afternoon after guiding my arm higher than I had managed the previous week. You actually did the exercises. I shrugged. You said staying broken costs more. A soft laugh escaped her before she could stop it. It was light, genuine, and completely unguarded. I realized then that I had not heard laughter like that in years. Most people laughed around me because they wanted something. Claire laughed because she forgot to be careful. The realization stayed with me long after the session ended. Week after week, our conversations remained surprisingly ordinary. She asked whether I had slept well after noticing the shadows beneath my eyes. She reminded me to drink more water because coffee was not a substitute for rest. She complained about New York traffic with the same quiet frustration as everyone else. She never asked about my business, my money, or the headlines that occasionally flashed across televisions in the waiting room. She treated me exactly as she treated the retired firefighter before me and the teenage baseball player after me. One rainy afternoon, while adjusting a resistance band around my wrist, she paused for the first time. You always look out the window before you leave, she said gently. Are you looking for someone? The question settled between us with unexpected weight. I stared at the rain sliding down the glass before answering. Someone who is not coming back. She did not rush to fill the silence with sympathy. She did not offer comforting cliches or tell me everything would be all right. Instead, she simply nodded. Losing someone changes the way you measure time, she said quietly. Some days feel like minutes. Other days feel like years. I turned toward her, surprised by the calm certainty in her voice. How do you know that? She smiled, but sadness briefly touched her eyes. Because grief does not care what job you have. It visits everyone eventually. There was no dramatic confession, no attempt to compare stories, only an understanding that somehow reached places words never could. When the session ended, I walked through the lobby more slowly than usual. One of the receptionists smiled at Claire and whispered, "He smiled today." Claire looked genuinely confused. Did he? She asked. I had not even realized it myself. For the first time since I had stood beside a white marble headstone 3 years earlier, the muscles in my face had remembered something my heart had almost forgot. The changes were so small that I never noticed them until other people began reacting to them. My assistant stopped reminding me to eat lunch because I had already started doing it on my own. The staff in my office no longer hesitated before knocking on my door. Even the atmosphere inside Blackwood Holdings felt lighter, though no one could explain why. They simply knew something had shifted. One Thursday morning, I walked through the executive floor carrying my own cup of coffee instead of asking someone else to bring it. Conversations paused for a heartbeat before quietly continuing. My chief of security, Ethan Cole, caught up with me outside the conference room, wearing the same unreadable expression he had perfected over 15 years. Everything all right? He asked. Why would it not be? I replied. He glanced toward the employees pretending not to watch us. You said good morning to 3 people. I frowned. Is that unusual? Ethan almost smiled. For you, it is practically a national holiday. His answer stayed with me through the meeting. Had I really become that distant? The numbers on the presentation screen blurred together while my thoughts drifted somewhere entirely different. Later that afternoon, one of my foundation directors requested funding for a rehabilitation program, serving injured veterans. Normally, I would have approved it without discussion and moved on to the next report. Instead, I found myself asking questions. How many families would benefit? Could the building remain open year-round? Did they have enough therapists? The director blinked in surprise before answering every question with growing enthusiasm. As I signed the approval, I remembered Claire explaining that healing rarely happened all at once. It happened one patient, one exercise, one difficult day at a time. Perhaps rebuilding a community worked the same way. The following Tuesday, I arrived at the clinic carrying a small box from a neighborhood bakery I had passed that morning. Claire looked at it, then at me, before crossing her arms with playful suspicion. "Is there a special occasion?" she asked. "No," I admitted. "The bakery smelled good." She laughed softly. "Then the front desk should enjoy those. Clinic policy says I cannot accept gifts from patients." Without the slightest hesitation, she picked up the box and placed it in the staff lounge for everyone to share. There was no embarrassment in her voice and no attempt to flatter me by making an exception. She simply followed the rules because they mattered to her. Watching the nurses and receptionists smile as they discovered fresh pastries somehow felt more satisfying than if she had kept them herself. As my session ended, Claire handed me a fresh treatment plan and said, "You are making great progress, Adrian. Not just with your shoulder." I paused with my hand on the door. "How can you tell?" She looked at me with the same calm honesty she always carried. "Because people who begin healing usually start noticing everyone else around them too." Autumn settled over Manhattan almost without warning. The trees outside the rehabilitation clinic traded their deep green for shades of amber and gold, and the cool morning air carried the familiar scent of rain long before the clouds arrived. By then, physical therapy had become little more than a reason to see Claire once a week. My shoulder was nearly back to normal. I could lift, reach, and move without the sharp reminder that had first brought me into her clinic. She knew it too. During one appointment, she folded my chart closed and smiled with quiet satisfaction. "2 more sessions," she said. "After that, I think you will be ready to graduate." The word graduate should have made me feel relieved. Instead, something tightened in my chest. I nodded without answering, and she tilted her head as though trying to understand a puzzle that refused to solve itself. "Most patients are happy when they do not have to come back," she said. "You look disappointed." I forced a small smile. "Perhaps I have become accustomed to your lectures." She laughed. "Those are professional recommendations, not lectures." Before I could answer, my phone vibrated across the treatment table. Ethan almost never interrupted my appointments unless something truly mattered. I glanced at the screen, silenced the call, and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Claire noticed, but continued adjusting the resistance bands with calm concentration. "Work can wait another 20 minutes, she said. "Your shoulder cannot." I listened without arguing. That alone would have surprised everyone who knew me. When the session ended, I finally returned Ethan's call from the parking garage. His voice was steady, but unusually serious. "Someone has been asking questions about your schedule." I stopped beside my SUV as cold winds swept across the concrete. "Who?" "We do not know yet. It may be nothing. But your visits to the clinic have become predictable." My eyes drifted toward the building behind me, where Claire was still visible through the second-floor windows, laughing with an elderly patient who had just completed his own therapy session. She had no idea that my life had taught me to recognize patterns because other people often watch them too. "Increase security around the building," I said quietly. "Do it without disturbing anyone." Ethan hesitated. "Including Miss Bennett?" I closed my eyes for a brief moment. Saying her name aloud somehow made the situation feel more real. Especially Miss Bennett. She must never know. As I ended the call, I looked back through the glass one last time. Claire was helping the elderly man put on his jacket, smiling with the same effortless kindness she offered everyone. She still believed she was simply helping a patient recover from an injured shoulder. She had no way of knowing that somewhere beyond those quiet streets, someone else had begun noticing the only person who had ever managed to heal a wound no doctor could see. The following week, I noticed the changes before anyone mentioned them. A dark sedan remained parked across the street from the clinic every morning, always leaving before noon. A man lingered at the corner coffee shop longer than necessary, pretending to read the newspaper while watching the entrance through the reflection in the window. Ethan's team confirmed what I had already suspected. Someone was paying attention, but not with enough confidence to make a move. They were waiting. Patience had always been dangerous because it usually belonged to people with a plan. Claire, meanwhile, continued living exactly as she always had. She walked the same 6 blocks from the subway station every morning carrying the same canvas tote bag filled with patient files and a paperback novel she somehow never had enough time to finish. She greeted the receptionist with the same cheerful smile. She remembered every patient's birthday. She stopped outside the clinic twice a week to refill the bird feeder hanging beneath the small maple tree because, as she once explained, the birds should not have to skip breakfast just because people are busy. It sounded like such a simple thought, yet I could not remember the last time I had noticed something so ordinary. My final therapy session arrived on a cool Tuesday afternoon. Claire completed the last strength test, compared it with the notes from my first visit, and smiled with unmistakable pride. "Full range of motion," she said. "Congratulations, Adrian. You did the work." I rolled my shoulders slowly, almost surprised that the pain was gone. I had a good teacher. She laughed softly before handing me the discharge paperwork. "Now promise me one thing." "What is that?" "Do not wait until something breaks before you start taking care of yourself again." Her words settled quietly between us. She thought she was talking about muscles and joints. We both knew she was not. I thanked her, shook her hand, and turned toward the door. Halfway there, I stopped. Something about leaving felt strangely permanent. "Claire," I said without looking back, "have you ever wondered whether helping someone changes your own life too?" She considered the question for a moment before answering. "I think it always does. We just usually notice it much later." I nodded and walked away before she could see the expression on my face. Outside, Ethan was waiting beside the SUV. He opened the rear door, then lowered his voice. Our people identified the man in the sedan. He disappeared the moment he saw additional security. Nearby, I glanced through the clinic window one last time. Claire was already welcoming her next patient with the same warm smile she had given me months earlier. She believed our story had ended with a healed shoulder. Standing there beneath the gray autumn sky, I realized ours had only just begun. For the first Tuesday in months, I did not have a reason to walk through the glass doors of Blackwood Medical Tower. My calendar filled itself with meetings, charity events, and endless decisions that once consumed every waking hour. Yet every afternoon my thoughts drifted back to the second-floor rehabilitation clinic. It was remarkable how quickly a place could become familiar simply because one person made it feel different. Claire had returned to her life, and I kept telling myself that I should return to mine. Instead, I found excuses to drive through that neighborhood on the way home. Never stopping, never walking inside, just passing slowly enough to see the warm lights glowing through the windows. Ethan noticed after the third time. "You know," he said from the front passenger seat, "most people just call someone when they want to see them." I looked out at the city slipping past the tinted glass. Most people have simpler lives. He nodded without arguing. He had served beside me long enough to recognize when silence carried more truth than conversation. A few days later, the foundation director requested my attendance at the opening of a new community rehabilitation center funded by our organization. I almost declined until I noticed the list of invited medical professionals. Claire Bennett's name appeared halfway down the page. I arrived early, standing near the back of the renovated gymnasium while local families explored the new equipment. Children laughed as they raced across the polished hardwood floor. Elderly couples admired the therapy rooms with grateful smiles. The entire building felt alive with hope, something that money alone could never purchase. Then I saw her. Claire was kneeling beside a young boy struggling to balance on parallel bars after a sports injury. She was not giving instructions. She was cheering for every tiny step as though each one deserved applause. When he finally crossed the short distance on his own, she clapped first, and within seconds the entire room joined her. The smile on the boy's face could have brightened the whole city. Watching from across the room, I understood something that had taken me months to learn. Claire never measured success by how important someone appeared. She measured it by how much stronger they became after believing they could not move forward. Eventually, she noticed me standing near the entrance. Surprise crossed her face before it softened into that familiar smile. She walked over, carrying the same quiet confidence that had first unsettled me months earlier. "I did not know you would be here," she said. "Neither did I admitted honestly. She laughed, shaking her head. "Well, I am glad you came." Those 6 simple words stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon because they carried no expectation, no hidden motive, and no fear. They sounded exactly like something I had forgotten people could still mean. After the ceremony ended, the crowd slowly disappeared into the cool evening, leaving the rehabilitation center wrapped in the quiet glow of its exterior lights. Volunteers folded chairs while children chased one another across the empty parking lot, with the kind of carefree laughter adults spent their entire lives trying to remember. Claire stood near the entrance collecting name tags, completely unaware that she was the last reason I had not yet walked away. "You stayed longer than most of the donors," she said as I approached. "I wanted to see whether people actually used the place after the speeches were over." She smiled. "That is the only part that really matters." We walked together without deciding to, following the sidewalk around the building where young maple trees had recently been planted. Their leaves rustled softly in the evening breeze. For a while neither of us spoke. The silence felt comfortable instead of empty. "Can I ask you something?" Claire finally said. "Of course." She looked ahead instead of at me. "When I first met you, you carried sadness like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Now it looks lighter." I took a slow breath before answering. "The weight is still there. I just learned that carrying it does not mean I have to stop living." She nodded as though the answer made perfect sense. That is usually how healing works. Before I could respond, my phone vibrated. Ethan's message appeared on the screen. The surveillance team had identified the people watching the clinic. They had disappeared completely 2 days earlier. No further activity. No remaining concerns. I stared at the message for several seconds before locking the screen again. Claire noticed the expression on my face. "Everything all right?" she asked. For months, I had hidden every complicated part of my world from her because I believed that was the safest gift I could offer. Standing beside her beneath the quiet autumn sky, I realized that protecting someone's peace sometimes also meant allowing yourself to believe in it. "Yes," I answered truthfully. "Everything is finally becoming all right." She smiled with quiet relief, then reached into her canvas tote bag and pulled out a small paperback novel with a folded receipt marking the page. "I finished it yesterday," she said. "You once told me you could not sleep very well. Reading helps sometimes." I accepted the book with unexpected care, as though it were something fragile. No expensive watch, custom suit, or business contract had ever felt as valuable as that well-worn paperback resting in my hands. As we reached the parking lot, she stopped beside my car and looked at me with the same calm kindness that had changed my life one ordinary therapy session at a time. "Take care of yourself, Adrian," she said softly. I smiled without forcing it because for the first time in years, those words no longer sounded impossible. They sounded like a promise I was finally ready to keep. Winter arrived quietly, covering the city in pale morning light that reflected from every rooftop and every window overlooking Manhattan. Months earlier, I would have watched that same skyline without seeing any of it. Now I found myself noticing the small things that had always existed beyond my own sorrow. A father walking his daughter to school while she skipped over cracks in the sidewalk. An elderly couple sharing a park bench with steaming cups of coffee. Office workers laughing before another busy day began. The world had never stopped moving. I had simply stopped walking with it. Claire and I never tried to force our story into something it was not ready to become. Instead, we allowed friendship to grow with the same patience she had taught me during physical therapy. Some evenings we met for coffee after work. Other weekends we volunteered together at the rehabilitation center where families recognized her long before they ever noticed me. She introduced me to people by my first name instead of my reputation, and somewhere along the way I realized I preferred the man she introduced. One Tuesday afternoon, nearly a year after I had first walked into her clinic with an injured shoulder and an exhausted heart, I returned to Rose Hill Cemetery carrying another bouquet of white roses. The winter air was cold enough to sting my face, yet I remained there longer than usual. I placed the flowers against the marble headstone and smiled gently instead of lowering my eyes. "Thank you," I whispered into the quiet, "for loving me when I needed it, and for teaching me that loving someone does not end when they are gone. It simply changes the way you carry them." The wind moved softly through the bare branches above me, almost like a familiar answer. When I turned toward the path leading back to the parking lot, Claire was waiting beside the entrance with 2 warm cups of coffee, her cheeks pink from the cold, and a knitted scarf wrapped loosely around her neck. She had not followed me because she was curious. She had come because she understood that some journeys were easier when someone simply waited at the end. She handed me one of the cups without asking a single question. We walked down the hill together in comfortable silence while the city stretched before us beneath a clear winter sky. For the first time in years, I did not feel as though I was leaving someone behind. I felt as though I was carrying every lesson that had shaped me into the man I finally wanted to become. People often believe strength is measured by the power to control a city, a fortune, or the future. They are mistaken. Real strength begins the moment one kind person reminds a broken heart that it is still capable of hope. Because sometimes the greatest rescue in the world is not being saved from darkness. It is remembering that you were always meant to walk toward the light.